In the summer of 1944, a Soviet journalist named Vasily Grossman arrived at a small village in northeastern Poland called Treblinka. He had heard rumors, impossible rumors, about what had happened there. He expected to find ruins, barbed wire, mass graves, evidence of the crime. What he found was a farm. A quiet, ordinary farm. A Ukrainian man named Trebl was living there with his family, growing vegetables on land the Germans had given him. There were flowers. There were chickens. But something was wrong with the earth. It was too soft. It moved in ways soil should not move. And when it rained, the ground did not just get wet, it sank, in long irregular patches, as if something enormous beneath it was still settling. Grossman bent down and picked up a handful of dirt. Mixed in with the soil were fragments of bone, hair, scraps of cloth, a child's shoe. He wrote, "Everything here breathes of death. Everything here screams of it. Treblinka is not a concentration camp. It is not a prison. Treblinka is a conveyor belt of death." Between July 1942 and August 1943, the Germans operated a killing center here that murdered more than 900,000 human beings, mostly Jews from Poland, but also from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Greece, and Yugoslavia. It operated for just 13 months. In those 13 months, more people were killed at Treblinka than in the entire first year of the war on the Eastern Front. And when it was done, the Nazis built a farm on top of it and tried to pretend it had never existed. This is the story of how they failed. To understand Treblinka, you have to understand what came before it. By the end of 1941, the Nazi regime had been killing Jews for years, through ghettos, shootings, starvation, and mobile killing units called Einsatzgruppen that followed the German army into the Soviet Union and shot entire communities into mass graves. But Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, had a problem. The killings were inefficient. They were traumatizing to the soldiers doing the shooting. And they were not fast enough. In January 1942, senior Nazi officials gathered at a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee outside Berlin for what became known as the Wannsee Conference. In 90 minutes, they finalized what they called the final solution to the Jewish question, the systematic murder of every Jew in Europe. The plan was called Operation Reinhard ***, named after Reinhard Heydrich, the senior SS official assassinated by Czech resistance fighters in May 1942. Operation Reinhard called for the construction of 3 dedicated killing centers in occupied Poland, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These were not concentration camps. There were no barracks, no prisoner numbers, no slave labor system. The sole purpose of these facilities was killing, as quickly as possible, with as little trace as possible. Treblinka was chosen because of its location, a remote area near the Bug River, surrounded by forests, accessible by an existing railway line that connected it to Warsaw, just 100 kilometers away. The Warsaw Ghetto, the largest Jewish ghetto in occupied Europe, held nearly 400,000 people. Construction of Treblinka II, the death camp, distinct from Treblinka I, a nearby labor camp, began in May 1942. Jewish forced laborers from the surrounding area built it under German supervision. Most of them were killed when the construction was complete. The man appointed to command the camp was an Austrian SS officer named Franz Stengel. He had already overseen the T4 euthanasia program, in which the Nazis had murdered disabled German citizens. Stengel was experienced, efficient. He wore a white riding jacket as he walked the grounds. He later told journalist Gitta Serini, "My professional aim was to process the transports as quickly and as efficiently as possible." He called the victims cargo. The camp was divided into 2 sections. The lower camp, where the trains arrived, was designed to look, at first glance, like an ordinary transit station. There was a fake clock on the platform. Fake train schedules posted on the wall. Signs for a ticket office. Flowers planted in window boxes. The deception was deliberate and calculated. The Germans had learned that people who understood what was happening fought back. People who believed they were being resettled or deloused walked forward on their own. The upper camp, separated from the lower camp by a narrow path to prisoners called the Tube or the Road to Heaven, contained the gas chambers. Treblinka was ready for operation in late July 1942. On July 22, 1942, the first trains arrived from Warsaw. The transports came by freight train, sealed cattle cars, 80 or more people per car, packed so tightly that many died from suffocation or thirst before the doors were even opened. When the train pulled into the Treblinka platform, the guards, German SS officers, and Ukrainian auxiliaries ordered everyone out immediately. The noise was overwhelming. Dogs barked. Guards shouted. People screamed for lost family members. The elderly and the sick who could not move fast enough were shot on the spot. Men and women were separated immediately. A German officer, sometimes Stengel himself in his white jacket, addressed the crowd. He told them they were at a transit camp. They would shower, be deloused, and then continue their journey east for resettlement. They needed to hand over their valuables for safekeeping and undress for the showers. Some believed him. Others sensed the truth. A smell hung over the camp, sweet and sickening, the smell of burning flesh from the pits just beyond the fence. Some people understood what it meant. A few tried to run. They were shot. The women and children were taken first. They were ordered to undress and hand over all remaining valuables. Their hair was shaved. It was used for mattress stuffing in German submarines. Then they were pushed down the tube, a narrow, fenced path about 150 meters long, lined with tree branches woven through the wire so no one could see out. At the end of the tube were the gas chambers, a brick building with 6 chambers, later expanded to 10. The Germans used carbon monoxide piped in from diesel engines. The entire process, from arrival to death, took approximately 2 hours. The bodies were dragged out by Jewish prisoners called the Sonderkommando, men forced to work the camp under threat of death, who sorted clothing, extracted gold teeth, and carried the bodies to mass graves. At peak operation, Treblinka killed 6,000 people per day. On some days, it was 10,000. In August 1942 alone, a single month, approximately 200,000 people were murdered here. Survivor Chil Rajchman, one of the very few who lived to write about it, described those first days. I arrived on September 27, 1942. Of the 6,000 people in my transport, I was among a small group selected to work. Everyone else was dead within 2 hours of arrival. The victims came from across occupied Europe. From the Warsaw and Białystok ghettos. From small shtetls in eastern Poland where entire communities were loaded onto trains in a single day. From Germany, Austria, Greece, Bulgaria. From their Scienstad in Czechoslovakia, where, in one transport, the Germans sent the residents of a Jewish retirement home. The guards at Treblinka were approximately 150 in total, around 30 German SS, the rest Ukrainian auxiliary police recruited largely from Soviet POW camps. The camp functioned like a factory, and its product was death. It ran on terror, deception, and speed. And at its center, presiding over it all in his white jacket, was Franz Stengel, who never once, even after the war, expressed remorse for what he had done. Not everyone who arrived at Treblinka died immediately. A small number, perhaps 700 to 1,000 at any given time, were selected to work. They were the Sonderkommando, prisoners forced to keep the killing machine running. They sorted and processed the belongings of the dead, extracted gold teeth from corpses, carried bodies to the burial pits, and maintained the camp facilities. Their lives were a form of torture that defies easy description. They lived in the shadow of what they were forced to do, often recognizing people they knew, neighbors, relatives, among the arriving transports. They were fed and housed marginally better than the arriving victims, given a few extra days or weeks of life. But they knew their own deaths were coming. The Germans rotated and killed Sonderkommando regularly to prevent them from organizing or from carrying knowledge out of the camp. Samuel Willenberg, one of the last living survivors of Treblinka, who died in 2016 at the age of 93, recalled arriving in October 1942. He was 19 years old. He survived because he falsely told the guards he was a plasterer. He spent the next 9 months living inside Treblinka, watching everything. He later said, Treblinka was a world without hope. But even in a world without hope, human beings find ways to resist. The resistance inside Treblinka grew slowly and in secret. By early 1943, something had shifted in the camp. The pace of transports had slowed, the Warsaw Ghetto was being emptied, and there were fewer Jews left to kill. The Germans began talking about closing Treblinka. If that happened, the Sonderkommando knew what would come next. A secret organizing committee formed among the prisoners. They called themselves the Underground Committee. Its leaders included Dr. Julian Korzicki, a former Polish army doctor who served as camp physician, and later a man named Zelo Bloch, a former Zionist youth leader from Czechoslovakia. Their plan: steal weapons from the camp armory, arm as many prisoners as possible, set fire to the camp, and break through the fence. To get weapons, they needed money. Gold and valuables smuggled from the piles of confiscated belongings were secretly exchanged with Ukrainian guards for pistols and grenades, one transaction at a time, over months, at enormous personal risk. Dr. Korzicki was discovered with money in his pocket in April 1943. A guard caught him by accident. Rather than betray the others, he swallowed poison he had hidden for exactly this moment. He died before he could be questioned. The plan continued without him. By the summer of 1943, the committee had accumulated a small cache of weapons, pistols, grenades, and some rifles. Not enough for a military assault, but perhaps enough for a breakout. They set the date, August 2nd, 1943. A Monday. The signal would be a single gunshot. The morning of August 2nd began like any other morning at Treblinka. The prisoners went about their assigned work under the watch of guards. The sun was already hot by 10 a.m. The Underground Committee moved quietly through the camp, passing word, "Today is the day." The plan called for small groups of prisoners to slip into the armory and the garage, steal weapons and fuel, distribute them to fighters across the camp, and at 3:30 p.m., ignite the gasoline and start the revolt. But nothing went according to plan. A guard became suspicious of unusual activity near the garage. Fearing discovery, one of the prisoners shot him at approximately 3:45 p.m., early, before the weapons had been fully distributed. The shot rang out across the camp. For a moment, everything stopped. Then, chaos. Grenades were thrown. Fuel that had been sprinkled across buildings was lit. Within minutes, the wooden structures of the camp were burning, the barracks, the sorting warehouses, the fake train station with its fake clock. Prisoners grabbed tools, knives, weapons, anything they could find, and rushed the fences. Some cut through the wire. Some climbed over it. Others were shot before they could reach it. Approximately 300 to 400 prisoners made it past the fence that day and ran into the surrounding forests. The Germans and Ukrainian guards responded quickly. Armed pursuit parties fanned out into the forest. Aircraft were used to locate and machine gun groups of fleeing prisoners. Neighboring villages were warned and, in some cases, local civilians and police helped catch escaping Jews. Of the 300 to 400 who escaped the fence, approximately 100 survived the initial pursuit. Of those, perhaps 70 survived the war, hidden by sympathetic Poles in forests and villages, or fighting with partisan units. Samuel Willenberg was one of them. He ran into the forest with 2 other prisoners. He hid for days, then weeks, eventually making his way to Warsaw, where he survived in hiding until the end of the war. Chil Rajchman also escaped that day. He had been at Treblinka since September 1942. He survived by hiding in forests and eventually reaching safety. He later wrote, "I ran and ran. I did not think. I only ran." The Uprising did not liberate Treblinka. Most of the killing infrastructure remained intact. The Germans continued operating the camp at reduced capacity for another month, before shutting it down in October 1943. But the uprising at Treblinka, like the ones at Sobibor and in the Warsaw Ghetto, was an act of profound courage. These were people who knew they were going to die. They chose to die fighting rather than waiting. And they ensured that some witnesses would survive to tell the world what had happened here. The prisoners of Treblinka did not destroy the camp, but they refused to let the camp destroy all of them. After the uprising, the Germans accelerated something they had already begun. In the spring of 1943, Heinrich Himmler had visited Treblinka and been disturbed by what he found, specifically, by the state of the mass graves. The bodies buried in pits since 1942 were decomposing, the ground heaving and cracking under the pressure of gases. In some places, the earth had split open. He ordered an operation known as Operation 1005 ***, the systematic exhumation and burning of every body at every Operation Reinhard camp. At Treblinka, Jewish prisoners, forced to work under threat of death, were made to dig up the mass graves. They used enormous bone-crushing machines to grind the remains. They built massive open-air pyres, iron rails laid across stone foundations, and burned the bodies around the clock for weeks. The smoke was visible for miles. When the burning was complete, the ashes were mixed back into the soil. Then the Germans dismantled the camp entirely. The gas chambers were dynamited. The fences were removed. The barracks were torn down. The earth was plowed and replanted. They built a farmhouse. They planted lupin flowers across the entire area. They brought in a Ukrainian man named Strebel to live there and farm the land, a permanent, living disguise. By early 1944, Treblinka looked like it had never existed. When Soviet forces liberated the area in July 1944, there was nothing to see. But Vasily Grossman, arriving weeks later, understood what the ground was telling him. He interviewed local witnesses, Poles from surrounding villages, who had seen the transports arriving day after day. Who had smelled the smoke? Who had watched the flames at night? He published The Hell of Treblinka in the Soviet journal Znamya in November 1944. It was the first major account of what had happened there, and it became part of the evidence presented at the Nuremberg trials. The Germans had tried to erase Treblinka from the earth. They had burned 900,000 bodies and plowed the ashes into the soil. But they could not erase the witnesses. They could not erase Vasily Grossman. They could not erase Samuel Willenberg or Chil Rajchman. They could not erase the memories of hundreds of Polish villagers who had watched the trains go in and never come out. Treblinka was not erased. It was only hidden, and badly hidden at that. After the war, the perpetrators of Treblinka scattered. Franz Stengel, the commandant in the white jacket, fled Europe through a network of Catholic contacts and former SS members known as the Rattlin. He made his way to Syria, then Brazil, where he lived openly under his own name in Sao Paulo, working at a Volkswagen factory. He was not hiding. He was simply waiting. In 1967, Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal tracked him down. Stengel was extradited to West Germany and put on trial. In 1970, he was convicted of co-responsibility for the murder of 900,000 people, the largest individual death toll attributed to any single defendant at that time. He was sentenced to life in prison. He died of heart failure in his cell on June 28, 1971, 18 hours after giving his final interview to journalist Gitta Serini. In that interview, he had finally, haltingly, admitted that what happened at Treblinka was wrong. But he never said he felt guilty. The Treblinka trials, held in Dusseldorf between 1964 and 1965, prosecuted 10 former guards and SS officers. Most received minimal sentences. Some were acquitted entirely. The German legal system of the era struggled to assign meaningful punishment to men who claimed they were following orders. The Treblinka trials were seen by many survivors as a profound failure of justice. The case of John Demyanik, a Ukrainian-born American who was identified by survivors as Ivan the Terrible, a sadistic guard known for personally brutalizing prisoners before gassing, became one of the most controversial war crimes trials in history. After decades of legal proceedings across multiple countries, Demjanjuk died in 2012 at the age of 91, before his final German conviction for accessory to murder could be appealed. Of the roughly 150 men who ran Treblinka, fewer than 20 faced any meaningful criminal consequences. Most died peacefully. Most were never identified. The machinery of mass murder had been not only physical, built in wood and brick and diesel engines, but bureaucratic, dispersed across hundreds of participants who each played their part and then vanished back into ordinary life. This is one of the hardest truths of Treblinka. It was not the work of monsters. It was the work of ordinary men who made monstrous choices. Today, Treblinka is a memorial site in the Polish countryside. There are no original buildings, they were all destroyed. There are no gas chambers to walk through, no barracks to photograph. There is only the landscape, fields, forest, and sky. And the stones. In 1964, a memorial was built on the site. It consists of more than 17,000 granite stones of varying sizes, placed across the field where the camp once stood. Each stone represents a community, a town, a village, a city, whose Jewish population was murdered here. The largest stones bear names: Warsaw, Radom, Czestochowa, Białystok. In the center stands a single large stone monument, cracked down the middle. In 2016, archaeologists from Staffordshire University in England used ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technology to survey the site. What they found confirmed what witnesses had always said: beneath the surface, despite the burning and the plowing and the farmhouse and the flowers, evidence of Treblinka remained. The outlines of the gas chambers, the foundations of buildings, the remains of the railway siding, and, distributed across a vast area, the fragmentary human remains that no burning could entirely eliminate. The archaeologists did not excavate. Jewish religious law holds that the dead should not be disturbed. The site remains as it is, a memorial and a grave. Samuel Willenberg, who survived the uprising and lived to see the memorial built, visited Treblinka many times in his later years. He would walk among the stones and name them, not the stones, but the people they stood for. He made sculptures of the uprising for the rest of his life. Twisted bronze figures, running, fighting, falling. He died in 2016 at the age of 93. He was the last known survivor of the Treblinka uprising. There is no one left who was there. Which is why what you do next matters. If this story moved you, share it. Leave a comment. Tell someone. The perpetrators of Treblinka bet everything on silence. Every time we speak about it, they lose. Subscribe to Legacy of History for more stories that were almost lost.